Hello scholars, Dr. Nystrom here to talk about close reading for nonfiction. Nonfiction means that we are talking about narrative text that is not a creative work of imagination, but rather a text based on facts, real events, real people. In this case, we're going to read an informational article together about a vaccine for COVID-19. It was published on December 14th. 2020. When reading nonfiction, there are certain moves that we can make as readers to help us unpack the texts that we encounter, just like we did with short stories when we read for characterization, plot, inferences, and identified a theme. The first thing to do when reading nonfiction is to set your purpose for reading. Now, since this article happens to be about a vaccine for COVID-19, what kinds of things do you think we might want to find out? What's pressing on your thoughts about this topic lately? For the sake of this tutorial, I identified two prompts I think might be on everyone's mind. When will I get a vaccine? And what do I need to know about developing a vaccine that will help me understand how long it might take before one is available? It's important to set the purpose for reading because that cues us for what we'll be looking for throughout the reading. So now let's take a look at the article for today. First, COVID-19 vaccine approved in the US. What does that mean for you? Already, the title holds promise for answering our purpose for reading, so I'm a little excited. But there's more to do before we just dive into reading. I mean, sometimes we start reading something and it's pretty difficult to understand, so before we get lost and frustrated, there are things we can do to prepare and structure our reading so we get the most out of it and can get better at reading altogether. Here are the steps we're going to take. The second move, we already did our first move, which was identifying the purpose for reading. The second move is to divide the text into manageable chunks. Sometimes looking at the whole thing all at once is a bit daunting. In other words, it'll start making us nervous even before we begin. So we can break it up into sections of text that are easier to read and easier to deal with one at a time. Luckily, today the sections are pretty much broken up and labeled for us. Third, we'll read this more than once. Depending on how long a text is and how important the text is or portions of the text are, we can read it any number of times. For today's purposes, we only need to read it twice. Phew. Okay, so we're going to begin reading. We're going to be reading for the first time what the text says directly. That's all we're looking for. We're looking for information that we can literally point to in the text. Together, this information gives us more important main points of each section. So I'm going to be reading and annotating for information I think is really important. For example, dates, figures, those are probably important, right? And sometimes vocabulary and concepts can be important as well, like what is the FDA and what's their purpose? When we do a second reading, we're thinking about inferences, just like when we took quotations directly from the text when we were doing short stories to make statements about the unknown made on the basis of the known. When reading informational texts, we think about the direct evidence we identified in the first reading to figure out what the author is really trying to convey, the thesis or theme of the article. That deepens our understanding of the text. So this time I'm annotating for the information I think might lead to new understanding, like what the author is really trying to convey. And here I'm relying on contrasts and contradictions, just like in fiction, to notice something that seems important somehow, that gets me even closer to fulfilling my purpose for reading. And that's what we're going to do next. Once we've completed the activities that we just talked about, we want to go back to the prompts that we created in the beginning when we set our purpose for reading. With the direct evidence that we pulled from the text and the inferences that we pulled from the text, we can now respond to our reading for purpose prompts. What do we come up with? I bet it's going to be pretty good. Using that information, we can come up with answers to the questions we have and thus fulfill our purpose for reading. Okay, so for today's lesson, I created a series of questions for the first and second set of readings of this article. The first read questions are direct evidence questions. The answers are directly in the text. The second read questions are things that you can figure out as you annotate and read for the second time, particularly using contrast and contradiction strategy. When you've completed those two things, you'll be able to answer the prompts for our purpose for reading. In that case, I want you to write a paragraph answering those two questions. That's it. Good luck.